A story of silence. But listen closely. Connecting minds. Connecting from Africa for the world.
So apparently Africa is done with borders. Yes, those same borders people have been fighting, dying, and bribing their way through for decades. Poof, gone, just like that. And who made this announcement? A committee of experts? A coalition of 54 presidents? Nope, one guy from Burkina Faso, wearing sunglasses, surrounded by soldiers. President Ibrahim Traoré, aka Africa's youngest head of state and newest political wildcard, stepped on stage and casually dropped the biggest political bombshell since, well, ever. His plan? One government, one currency called Afro money, because why not? One passport for all Africans, a single unified Africa. No borders, one flag, basically the Avengers of geopolitics. And here's the thing, he didn't float this as a wild dream. He said it's starting now, like teams are already working on it kind of now. The internet lost its mind, hashtags exploded, TikToks dropped. Some people cheered, others blinked and went, does this guy know how many civil wars we've had this year? And yet, deep down, people listened, because no matter how wild it sounds, there's something about what he said that hits a nerve. We're going to unpack all of it. The plan, the hype, the political minefield, and why this United States of Africa might be the boldest idea ever, or the most chaotic group project in modern history. If you've ever struggled with visas, exchange rates, or just understanding why you need a passport to visit your cousin one country over, stick around. You're going to enjoy this ride, or at least feel mildly attacked. Traoré's plan isn't just a feel-good quote for your Instagram story. He's actually serious, like putting together task forces serious. Because apparently when he said one Africa, he wasn't doing a TED Talk. He was declaring a merger, a geopolitical Uber Eats order for one government, one currency, one all-access passport. Hold the French military, extra sovereignty on the side. Let's break this fairy tale down. One government. He's not talking about a Zoom call between presidents once a year. He's talking about a centralized African authority, one that can dictate foreign policy, manage defense, and decide things like trade sanctions and war declarations. You know, small stuff. One currency, Afro money. The idea? All 54 African nations dump their currencies and adopt one single note. No more CFA franc, which, by the way, is still basically controlled by the French Treasury. No more pegged exchange rates to the euro or the dollar. Just one currency for 1.4 billion people, because that's gone super smoothly in other regions, right? One passport. All Africans get a universal travel document. No more visas to visit your neighbor. No more you need a return ticket to enter this country you share a border with. Just pull out your shiny new Afro passport and stroll across Africa like it's one big festival. And the wild part? There are already teams working on it. Sources in his administration say they're studying the logistics, currency convergence, legislative alignment, even biometric ID systems. Yes. While most governments are figuring out potholes, Traoré's team is out here designing Wakanda 2.0. But here's the question Traoré didn't answer. Who runs this united Africa? Because last time we checked, some African presidents have been in power longer than TikTok has existed. And none of them seem like the share the throne type. Also, just a note, Africa has more than 2,000 languages, 54 national constitutions, and a track record of regional blocs that can't even agree on lunch, let alone monetary policy. And still, people are listening, because he's not the first one to say this. Back in the 1960s, Kwame Nkrumah pushed for a United States of Africa. He warned that without economic unity, political independence would just become a new form of dependence. Spoiler, he was right. Colonial powers left, but the debt, trade imbalances, and puppet economics stayed. Now, Traoré isn't quoting Nkrumah, He's trying to finish what he started, with less poetry, more military boots. Would you want your country run by a pan-African cabinet, or are you already picturing your president in a continental power struggle? Reality show. Tell me, Unity or Survivor? African edition. Unity sounds great, until you remember Africa isn't one country, it's 54, with different flags, different currencies, different national anthems, and more importantly, very different problems. So while Traoré's speech made the internet cry Pan-African tears of joy, it also made every diplomat on the continent reach for antacids. Let's start with the crown jewel of contradictions: sovereignty. Every leader loves the idea of Africa united, as long as they're the one in charge. Ask yourself this: what's more likely, your president giving up power to a centralized African government, or extending their term again for stability? We've seen term extensions dressed up as constitutional reforms so many times, it's practically a genre. Now imagine these same leaders voluntarily dissolving their national power into a joint system. Yeah, not happening over brunch. Let's look at the numbers. There are over 20 African leaders who've been in power for more than 10 years. Some passed the baton to themselves, others just eliminated the baton altogether. Unity means accountability, shared control, continental checks and balances. But that's a tough sell in a region where power is a private inheritance, not a public trust. Next up, the economy. Africa is home to some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and also some of the poorest. Nigeria's GDP is around $477 billion. Burundi's is $3.4 billion. South Africa's economy can swallow Lesotho, Eswatini, and Malawi for breakfast, and still have room for dessert. So when you say shared currency and pooled budgets, rich countries here subsidize your neighbors, and poor countries here who's actually in control of this. It's not malicious, it's math. A union that works needs economic alignment, not just emotional excitement. Let's bring in some EU context. The Eurozone nearly collapsed in 2009 during the Greek debt crisis, and that was between countries with functioning institutions and similar regulatory systems. Now imagine building something similar in Africa, where national budgets aren't always public. Corruption isn't a rumor, it's an office expense, as some countries don't even have consistent electricity, let alone centralized fiscal systems, and we haven't even touched security yet. As of this year, there are ongoing conflicts in Sudan, the Eastern DRC, the Sahel, Somalia, and parts of Cameroon. Militant groups, arms smuggling, political coups. It's not exactly the best environment for open borders and free movement. Unity without stability isn't progress. It's a shared disaster. Think of it like merging apartments when your neighbors are still throwing furniture at each other. Solidarity? Noble. But maybe wait until everyone stops yelling. And lastly, trust. Regional alliances like ECOWAS, SADC, and the African Union have existed for decades. But progress? Let's just say, the AU can organize great conferences. Implementation? That's another story. In 2018, African leaders signed the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, a historic step. Guess what? As of today, most countries still haven't fully implemented it. If we can't trade goods across borders without a 4-month delay and uncle fees at the customs office, how are we going to create one central authority? Here's the question no one wants to ask out loud. Are we building a united Africa, or just stacking all our dysfunctions into one giant folder labeled "Good luck"? Drop your honest take. Not the diplomatic version, the one you scream at the TV. Introducing Afro money, because nothing says unity like printing your own currency and hoping for the best. Yes, Traoré wants all African countries, rich, poor, broke, corrupt, stable, and permanently under construction, to dump their current currencies and adopt one single note. A bold move, especially from a guy whose own country's central bank still uses Excel sheets and prayer. But let's unpack this. The logic isn't wrong. Right now, Africa has over 40 different currencies, many unstable, many tied to external powers. Take the CFA franc, for example, used by 14 countries, controlled by the French Treasury. And guess what? Half the reserves have to be kept in France. It's like having a joint bank account with your ex who still controls the password. So yes, Afro money is an act of rebellion. It's a financial divorce from Europe. It says, thanks for the colonial hangover, but we'll handle our own hangover now. But here's the question. Can a continent where inflation is more common than electricity handle a shared currency? Let's go full economist mode for a second. A single currency requires a shared central bank, harmonized inflation targets, coordinated fiscal policies, real-time data systems, trust now. Let's look at reality. Nigeria just removed fuel subsidies and inflation shot past 30%. Zimbabwe's currency is so volatile, they had to create a new one in April 2024. Ethiopia is still in a conflict zone. South Africa has rolling blackouts daily. Chad and Sudan are drowning in debt. So yes, Afro money might be symbolic, but the economic operating system to run it does not exist. And then there's public psychology. You can create a currency, but you can't force people to believe in it. Ask Zimbabweans how they feel about saving in local currency. Ask Nigerians if they'd rather hold dollars under their bed. Ask any African cross-border trader what they use. Spoiler, it's usually USD or EUR because local money just isn't trusted. Trust is the real currency, and you can't mint that overnight. Let's not forget, even the euro almost collapsed during the Greek debt crisis. And that's the EU, with bureaucrats in suits, surveillance-level accounting, and Germany acting like the class monitor. What's the African version? A WhatsApp group with 54 finance ministers? And don't get me started on corruption. If Afro money ever becomes real, just know someone's cousin is already planning a fake printing press in their garage. Still, people want to believe because they're tired of using money they don't control, tired of currency instability making them poorer every year, tired of seeing their economies tethered to Europe's mood swings. And at its core, that's what Afro money represents. Not efficiency, not integration, but revenge dressed as economics. So tell me, Vito, if Afro money launched next year, would you convert your life savings into it? Or would you hold on to your dollars just in case? Because unity sounds good until your bank account starts shrinking. Next up on the African Avengers Starter Pack. One passport to rule them all. That's right. Traoré wants every African to carry one passport, travel anywhere on the continent visa-free, and live like we're in some kind of Wakandan Schengen zone. It sounds amazing, romantic even. A Nigerian studying in Rwanda, a Malian opening a business in Zambia, a Somali backpacking through Namibia. No visa fees, no embassy queues, no return ticket or you're denied entry drama. But here's the million-dollar question. Is Africa ready to open its doors when most of its neighbors are still setting them on fire? Let's talk reality. Right now, over 70% of African countries still require visas for fellow African nationals. In some regions, it's easier to get a visa for France than for Ghana. And Ghana is literally next door. Why? Because leaders don't trust each other. And more importantly, systems don't talk to each other. You want open borders? Great. Then explain how you'll handle cross-border crime track fugitives, secure biometric data, stop fake passports from flooding black markets. Spoiler, we can't even sync our power grids. You think we're ready to sync our immigration databases? Let's take a short trip to the EU, the poster child of free movement. The Schengen zone took decades to implement. And when the 2015 refugee crisis hit, borders went right back up. Even inside the EU, politicians screamed about migrants flooding the job market. Now take that, remove the institutional stability, remove the budget, and sprinkle some military coups and fragile ceasefires. Voila, the African version. Here's the messy truth. Open borders sound cute until someone actually walks through them. Let's be brutally honest. Some African nations are battling insurgents. Others are barely holding elections without Wi-Fi outages. And quite a few already blame their neighbors for economic sabotage. A single passport could easily turn from symbol of unity into a borderless panic button. And that's before we even talk about inequality. If open movement happens tomorrow, where do you think people will go? To countries with jobs, infrastructure, electricity that stays on longer than TikTok videos. South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Morocco. Prepare yourselves, because when people move, they don't follow dreams. They follow survival. Mini hook again. So maybe the real question isn't, can we move freely across Africa? It's, will we still be welcome when we do? Yet, here's the thing. Despite the chaos, despite the red flags, despite the very real risk, people still want it. Because nothing feels more insulting than needing a visa to visit land your grandfather walked on, or being treated like a foreigner on your own continent, or explaining to your kids why they can't see their cousins because border regulations say so. So here's the pitch. Do you believe a single African passport would bring people closer or create chaos faster? Would you pack your bags or build a fence? Drop your answer and be honest, because in a continent this big, freedom isn't just about movement, it's about trust. So let's say, hypothetically, this actually works. One government, one currency, one passport, one big, beautiful, barely functioning mega continent. Now ask yourself, how do you think the rest of the world would react? Short answer, not well. Because here's a secret about international politics. Nobody likes a self-sufficient Africa. For decades, global powers, the US, China, France, the UK, have treated Africa like a resource buffet with no bouncer. Need cobalt? Call Congo. Need oil? Nigeria. Need to dump expired vaccines or test facial recognition software? Africa's wide open. But if Africa suddenly became a unified negotiating bloc with its own central bank and defense strategy, that buffet closes. And now the waiters are asking you for identification. This isn't paranoia, it's precedent. Every time an African country tries to pivot away from the West, whether it's through currency reforms, nationalizing industries, or kicking out foreign troops, something weird happens. Suddenly there's a democratic crisis, or an IMF warning, or a suspiciously well-funded opposition movement with new social media campaigns. Ask Thomas Sankara, ask Patrice Lumumba, ask Muammar Gaddafi, who once proposed a single African gold-backed currency right before NATO liberated Libya into eternal civil war. Coincidence? Sure. And I'm also the Pope. Let's talk numbers. Africa controls 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, holds over 30% of global mineral reserves, has 1.4 billion people, a workforce larger than India or China by 2050. That's not a continent. That's a superpower in waiting. So when Traoré says, we don't want to be exploited anymore, you can almost hear boardrooms in Paris, Washington, and Beijing say, well, that's awkward. Now let's talk China, the polite colonizer. They've spent decades investing in African infrastructure, handing out shiny airports, ports, and loans with the enthusiasm of a sugar daddy on payday. But all those deals are bilateral. China likes talking to one country at a time, not an entire continent with a united finance ministry asking about debt restructuring. Same with the US, same with Europe, same with everyone else. Unity threatens the global order, not because it's radical, but because it's effective. You think the West wants Africa to be another EU? Absolutely not. Because when Africa sets the price instead of begging for it, Wall Street loses leverage, and Brussels loses influence, which means that a unified Africa won't just have to battle poverty or logistics. It'll have to survive global sabotage dressed as diplomacy, because every system that profits from African weakness won't go quietly. Here's the uncomfortable thought. Does the world fear African unity because it's unworkable, or because it might actually work? Drop your take. Because geopolitics isn't about morality, it's about leverage, and who's finally claiming theirs. While the diplomats argue and the think tanks run out of whiteboards, the real noise is coming from the streets. TikTok's on fire. X, is melting down. In the comments section, it's a full-blown African Union of opinions with memes because somehow, despite the politics, the skepticism, the global power games, people actually care, especially the young. We're talking about a generation that didn't grow up watching Pan-African leaders on state TV. They grew up watching Afrobeats on YouTube. They don't think in colonial borders. They think in vibes, apps, and connectivity. To them, One Africa isn't a UN resolution. It's a manifesto in the group chat. They're tired of needing 3 visas to attend a cousin's wedding, tired of converting currencies like it's an Olympic sport, tired of being called third world while exporting first world minerals. So when Traoré says Africa should unite, they hear something else. Maybe we don't have to wait anymore. But here's the plot twist no one likes to admit. Hope has trust issues because this same generation that he's also seen electricity go off mid-exam, politicians disappear mid-term, promises dissolve mid-sentence. They've heard New Africa speeches before. Right before someone's uncle got a contract to fix a bridge that was never broken. So yes, there's energy in the air, but there's also exhaustion. People are inspired, but also defensive, excited, but bracing for betrayal. They want to believe, but they've been trained to verify before celebrating. Still, the very fact that people are even talking about African unity like it's real, that's already historic. Because for decades, this conversation was reserved for professors in linen shirts at AU summits. Now it's being remixed on SoundCloud. Unity is trending. That doesn't mean it's happening, but it does mean people are hungry for it, or at the very least, desperate for something that isn't what they already know. And that's power, not political power, cultural power. Because when people believe in a shared identity, systems eventually have to follow. So maybe Traoré's real achievement wasn't proposing a currency. Maybe it was planting a question, a dangerous one. What if we stopped acting like strangers? Let's be honest. If unity was this easy, Africa would have done it between the second and third Pan-African Conference. But here we are, 60-plus years of speeches, slogans, and summit selfies later, and we still need a visa to visit Grandma. So what's stopping this big Afro revolution? Let's count the ways. 1. Power, as in no one wants to give it up. Unity sounds beautiful until it means less power for your president, who just conveniently rewrote the Constitution to stay in office for the sake of stability. You think those guys want to become regional governors under some African parliament in Nairobi? Please. These are leaders who treat national airlines like family Uber accounts. Now imagine telling them they have to share policy with 53 others. They'd rather resign. Kidding, they'd rather amend the Constitution again. 2. Money. The GDP gap across Africa is so wide you could drive the Trans-African Highway through it if it ever gets built. South Africa and Nigeria are continental economic giants. Burundi, Malawi, and South Sudan, barely floating. So when you say shared budget, what richer countries hear is national taxes, regional problems. Ask the EU how well that worked when Greece defaulted. Now imagine that drama with fewer auditors and more coups. 3. Security. Some African nations are in active war zones. Others are post-coup democracies still waiting on their transitional elections. Try launching open borders when you've got insurgents roaming the Sahel. Ethnic tensions boiling over in Ethiopia, pirates off the Somali coast, arms trafficking from Libya to Central Africa like it's Amazon Prime open movement without open stability. That's not unity. That's a borderless panic simulator. 4. Systems. For a continent that struggles to coordinate regional power grids, a unified financial and political system is ambitious. Ask ECOWAS how that shared currency is going. Short answer, it's not. The African Union's peacekeeping missions have been underfunded for years. The Continental Free Trade Agreement was signed in 2018, and it's still trying to get customs officers to stop charging processing fees in cash. We love ideas, but we also love bureaucracy, delays, and blaming logistics. 5. Trust. possibly the rarest natural resource in Africa. Forget diamonds, forget oil. Trust is the real deficit. People don't trust politicians. Politicians don't trust each other. And nobody trusts any plan with the words continental integration that doesn't also come with a lunch buffet. Unity isn't just paperwork, it's psychology. You can print a passport. You can mint Afro money. You can live stream speeches in 5 languages. But if no one believes in the system dies before it's even born. And we haven't even touched foreign interference. But we'll save that migraine for another episode. Bottom line, this might fail, not because the idea is bad, but because the system carrying it is full of cracks. Cracks we keep wallpapering over with hashtags and hope. So, what do you think? Is this the beginning of a bold new era? Or just another PowerPoint dream destined for a dusty AU archive? Do you trust the system enough to unite? Or are we just building a bigger stage for the same political theater? Comment below. And don't worry, we're not uniting comment sections yet. Say what you actually think. All right? We've dragged this dream through the mud. We've counted the cracks, measured the Ks, and even laughed at the logos. But what if, stay with me here, it actually works? What if, against all odds, Africa pulls it off? The meetings happen, the banks merge, the borders open, the presidents don't fight too much. And suddenly, Africa becomes one voice. Imagine the fallout. No, not the collapse kind, the power kind. Suddenly, the IMF can't play countries against each other. China has to negotiate with a whole bloc, not just buy off a minister and call it a day. The EU doesn't get to dump chicken parts in one market while demanding fair trade in another. And the world now has to respect a continent it used to politely ignore or quietly exploit. African passports get more valuable. Afro money becomes a legit trading currency. African talent stays in Africa because opportunities aren't leaking through visa denials anymore. And maybe, just maybe, the continent stops exporting raw materials and starts exporting finished power. Imagine if Congolese cobalt fuels African-owned EV companies. Nigerian tech startups scale across 54 markets with 1 license. Ghanaian creatives shoot films in Kenya and sell them in Ethiopia. No tax war, no paperwork, hell. And the best part, no one has to ask permission. Because for once, Africa isn't waiting for aid or validation or a new consultant from Switzerland. It's just building and inviting the world to deal with it on equal terms. Crazy? Maybe. But remember, once upon a time, people laughed at the idea of Europe becoming borderless too. And before that, at 13 broke American colonies saying, "We got this." History has a habit of mocking the impossible right before it copies it. So what do you think? Is this delusion dressed as strategy or the first glimpse of something we were told could never exist? Say it out loud, because if unity begins with imagination, then silence is just permission for things to stay broken. Let's rewind. Traoré made a speech. The internet freaked out. We laughed, debated, doubted, dreamed, and somehow landed on a single question. Who actually decides the future of Africa? Is it the presidents in palaces? The soldiers in fatigues? The foreign investors in air-conditioned boardrooms? Or, and this may sound radical, the people who live there? Here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Africa isn't poor because it lacks ideas. It's poor because too many great ideas never leave the PowerPoint, because decisions get made in echo chambers, because voices get filtered through bureaucracy, foreign interests, and security concerns, because people get inspired, but rarely get involved. And maybe that's the problem, not the dream, not even the leaders, but the disconnect between the speech and the street. You can talk about Afro money all day, but if the market woman in Accra can't buy bread without begging the bank manager, it's fiction. You can design one African passport, but if a 24-year-old in Niger still gets profiled at the airport for existing, it's performance art. And you can promise unity, but if people aren't part of the process, then all you've built is another flag for the same circus. So what now? You decide. Not because you're the president, but because the moment people stop deciding, someone else always decides for them. And usually, it's the wrong someone. If this future excites you, build it. If it scares you, question it. If it pisses you off, speak on it. But whatever you do, don't scroll past it. Because history isn't made by the loudest voice. It's made by the one that refuses to shut up.